right. Hello. Welcome to Open Source Friday. Figuring everything out right now. Let's see. I've got all my screens everywhere. Yeah, thanks very much for coming to the... At this point, this is technically the second edition, though if you did come to the first one, that was sort of the first edition, but we didn't really publish that. But yeah, today is a very special day because not only is it Friday, we actually have Tim Riley here. And Tim, you want to say hello?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Excellent. Yeah, so this is this little side project, this little passion project that I've been working on. Like Open Source Friday has been a thing. Like I think most companies and developers are aware. Maybe some developers aren't aware. I guess we shouldn't assume. But I'm super happy and pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you and talk about your project. But before I jump right in, I just want to say hello to the chat. Thanks for, I see Sean actually showed up. And thanks for staying up late with us, Sean. And Kuro Nico, happy to see you. Got the emojis coming in hot. And yeah, some other names that I cannot pronounce. But yeah, definitely come in the chat. I do want to also call out, if you do have questions about open source, questions about the project you want to talk about, questions about Tim or about GitHub, please use the chat to ask those questions, and we'll address them as we have some breaks, and especially at the end as well, if time permitting. I know Tim's family is actually out on a stroll, giving us some bandwidth, so which is amazing.
Yep,
but
clear air. Yep.
So Tim, I've talked enough. Do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us why you're here.
So I am Tim Riley. I am a software developer based in Canberra in Australia. And in the open source world, I work predominantly in the Ruby community. And I'm involved in several Ruby open source organizations. One of them is dry.rb, which will be our topic today. But of late, I've also been quite heavily involved in the Hanami project, and which is an effort between dry.rb, Hanami, and another organization I work with, ROM.rb, a persistence toolkit, to create an alternative web framework for Ruby. And together we're working on the version 2 release.
Okay. Wow. I know dry.rb, but I didn't actually take a poke into Hanami. But are you able to give us like a tour or maybe an explanation of like how that sort of how your involvement is played out through those projects, and particularly Hanami and dry.rb?
Well, my involvement mostly began, I guess for background, I've been working with Ruby for a very long time. And like many other Rubyists, Ruby on Rails was my tool of choice, my daily driver. But over many years and many projects, I began to feel somewhat dissatisfied with some of the outcomes I was getting with Rails. And I wanted to search for a better way, something to give me some guardrails to help me conceptualize my projects better, to organize my business logic better, to create projects that I can ship to meet client demands. I worked for a long time in an agency, but at the same time, not feel like I had to make so many shortcuts to get the project out the door under commercial pressure. And that's when I started discovering a community of people who were building up this alternative ecosystem of tools in Ruby. And this was back in 2014, 2015. And yeah, so I followed some people on Twitter, followed some of the work they're doing on GitHub, sent a few emails, and that ended up in a collaboration now that has lasted for nearly 5 years. It spans 3 different organizations, and the gems we've made, to my knowledge, are used by thousands of developers around the world and in some rather large organizations. So it's kind of great to see how a personal desire to change some aspect of your programming practice can actually turn into something so much bigger.
Yeah, so I'm curious, like at the point that you wanted to dig in deeper and actually like build these sort of quote unquote guardrails, had you already been involved in open source at that point? Like, did you know that was like a path to actually solve these problems?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the amazing things, I don't want to knock Ruby on Rails. It's an amazing project, and it's enabled many developers and made possible many projects. And one of the great things about it and about Ruby in general is that the source is all there. You know, you can can bundle in your project, hit bundle open on any gem, and instantly dig in. And this is not necessarily an experience you get with other ecosystems. And GitHub has been a part of that flow for a very long time too. So you see this as a collaborative hub and an easy way to see what people are doing and reach out to others. So yeah, I was familiar with open source. I hadn't made any serious investments in it. I dabbled. You throw up your personal projects online. I'd made a couple of gems which I used myself, but were perhaps of limited usage to others. So yeah, it wasn't from ground zero. I guess I'd done enough to start to feel confident, and that was some useful background, because when the moment did arrive, when I felt like there was an opportunity for me to actually create something of value that people would use to a great extent, I had sort of done the dabbling, done the learning, and I felt like I was equipped to get ready to go and hit the ground running.
Awesome. Yeah, so me personally, my introduction to programming and open source was Ruby on Rails as well. Like, I haven't contributed to Ruby on Rails, but my introduction was in that ecosystem. So having a clear path to solve a problem, which was I was building web apps, or I had an idea for a web app, and Ruby on Rails sort of gave me all sort of barriers included with it. So I'm super appreciative of that. And also being able to look at GitHub source code. I don't work on GitHub today, but I do look at the code, and I do ask a lot of questions to help solve my role, and being able to look at that code base and knowing exactly where things should be, and looking and just knowing they're there is super helpful. And I think having things like that is also super helpful. But speaking about having projects with barriers included, can we talk about dry.rb and what that is and what sort of problems it solves?
Certainly. So one of the defining aspects of dry.rb is you can choose how many batteries you want to include, because it is a collection of relatively small libraries, with each one trying to solve a common task. And we call them next generation Ruby libraries. It's because we're building on the back of years of learning, working in the Ruby community, and we're bringing those learning experiences together and packaging them up in these gems that we ship. So they try and tackle a range of problems, and they do it in a fairly coherent way. So a lot of the dry.rb, what's interesting about a lot of the dry.rb libraries is that they follow this blended, functional, object-oriented approach to Ruby, which hasn't always been very widespread in the Ruby community, but we've found it to be really helpful. Ruby is a multi-paradigm language. You can write highly functional code in it, but you can also write highly object-oriented code in it. That's one of the amazing things about the language. It's so malleable. But what we've found is that if we just do a few things like minimizing mutable state in our applications, minimizing globals, making it so that the objects that you work with can have a really clear flow of data through them, then what you achieve is a really clear understanding of the flow of logic in your application. Yeah. So these gems together create that effect when you use them.
Okay, so am I correct in we started with talking about Ruby on Rails and all batteries included, and you mentioned you could choose what batteries you want. So could you technically build a Ruby on Rails with a bunch of next generation libraries that you had mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. And for the last few years, it's been something that you have to do with sort of a lot of perseverance on your own behalf. You've got to figure out how to connect things. We did create a few different sort of umbrella helpers that combine the gems together, and we integrated them with the Rhoda routing framework, which is a Sinatra-style micro routing library, but using routing trees. But now we're doing it with the Hanami project, because Hanami already has a lot of visibility. It has a strong user base. Luca, the maintainer of that project, his vision for a web framework experience very much aligns with ours. And so what we're seeing here, I think, is a new model of collaboration in the Ruby open source community, where we have multiple distinct groups working together to create something that is coherent and batteries included, while each project still maintains its own identity, and while each project still provides a set of clear independent abstractions. So often if you spin up a Rails project, you get everything from the Rails organization bundled up there together for you. But because they're all developed together, it does mean that sometimes it's a bit harder to dig down and tease things apart. And there are ongoing efforts for that, but it's not their priority, the Rails community. Whereas ours is very much a bottom-up approach to development. We've implemented all the dry.rb libraries on their own first to be independently useful, and then we made sure that they are composable as gems, so that you can bring them together in a way that the sum of their parts, that the end result is greater than the sum of their parts. So that's how we're looking. That's the model for this project, which is, yes, a coherent, batteries included framework experience up top, powered by independent and still independently useful libraries and organizations for those who do want to just use them on their own or replace certain parts of the framework with something else.
Okay, and then I'm curious about Hanami. I know we started talking about dry.rb, but and we were focused on dry.rb, but it seems like there's a part of your fan club is actually here. Well, your fan club. One of your contributors or I guess users. I don't know. We wouldn't call them customers in this space, but so Iowowski actually came through and asked a question in the chat. He's familiar with Hanami 2 in the template. How does it actually map up to the official Hanami 2 application structure? Follower, he's correcting me. Follower is what he mentioned. Is Hanami 2 going to be a set of libraries that you can pick from, or is it going to be provide app structure out of the box like version 1?
It will provide an experience that is similar to what Hanami provided in version 1, just a retooled experience and refined experience. The Hanami 2 project is an extremely ambitious effort because we have big goals, but in reality, it's worked on by 4 or 5 people at nighttime after work. And across, well, me in Australia and the rest of them in Europe. I get like 45 minutes a day when I can talk to them. So the plan is still to provide a all batteries included framework with a blessed structure, recommended structure. But I have a very strong motivation to make every part of that configurable or opt out if you want to do something different. And one thing I've realized is that, the effort to make Hanami 2 is going to take as long as it takes. It's volunteer labor. We do it because we love doing it. And we're trying to create tools that we want to use in the future. But it takes as long as it takes. But in the meantime, I've actually been using Hanami 2 for over a year, using the unstable branches of many of the gems. And so I figured people out there in the community who are interested in it shouldn't have to wait until we've shipped the next alpha, which we're working very hard on doing, but that might still be another month away. In the meantime, I have this whole application structure that I've cobbled together using various Hanami 2, dry.rb, ROM.rb components that I could share with the community. So that's what I did just a couple of weeks ago. I made a GitHub template repository that shows how you can make a Hanami 2 application today if you're willing to live on the bleeding edge and willing to figure a few things out. And really, that's a great way for people who are interested in seeing the progress of development, because they can follow that template as it evolves. They can go in and try things for themselves. And it just makes that first step a bit easier because they don't have to worry about bringing together the components. That's done. They can then just go in and say, oh, how would I implement my business logic? Or how would I make my blog in 15 minutes inside this framework, such as it is right now?
Excellent. And I'm curious of adoption. We at least have one follower in the chat, but adoption for things like dry.rb and Hanami, like, are you seeing a good amount of feedback and collaboration and conversation for projects to this nature?
Yeah, so I think it might make sense just to talk a little bit about what the dry.rb libraries do.
Yeah, actually,
we touched on them on a high level.
Let's actually transition to sharing. I'll share my screen actually.
Mm-hmm.
Once I figure out where that button went. There we go. And then
maybe if you hop to the homepage, your other tab, we can take a look at some of the examples.
Oop. Seems like there we go. That should work. Sorry, I'm just making sure everybody can see everything. So, Sorry, you mentioned the home tab?
If you just change your other Chrome tab.
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Excellent.
So if you scroll up a little bit, so these represent some of the things that the dry.rb libraries do. And the question was about adoption. And I think one of the benefits from approaching creating Ruby gems in this way is that it's very easy to adopt particular gems. You don't need to throw out everything you've done, your whole app framework. You know, Hanami 2 is an ambitious effort to create a framework of the future, but it's fair to say that not everyone's going to rewrite their application on Hanami 2 as soon as it comes out.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, there are these gems that can satisfy particular needs. So dry validation is probably the second oldest of our gems, and it's gone through a lot of development over the years because it's an incredibly important and common task. Yeah. So dry validation is a library to help you validate any kind of data that you want your application to process. So if you're building a web app in Ruby, what I always recommend is trying to validate your data as close to the edge of your application as possible. So as soon as you've received your HTTP request, or as soon as you've got a JSON document that you want to process. And dry validation lets you do that via standalone validation contracts. So that means you can make a validation contract for every single different use case in your application. Whereas with the active record or active model style validations, those are often bundled up with the actual domain object that they're meant to concern, which is helpful in some ways because they're all together. But as soon as your application grows, and applications always do, you start to want to break out and validate things differently in different contexts. Yeah. And dry validation.
Do you have an example of the difference? Because I'm familiar with Active Record and the validations that they give you for free in Rails.
Yeah. So an example might be, say you're building a blog and you have two types of users in your admin area. You've got regular publishers and you've got sort of editors. And the editors might be permitted to set some more flags on articles, like they might be allowed to set the publication date or some other sort of publishing workflow flags. So in this case, you have two different people editing your blog posts. One of them, the regular author, can only set the title and the body. And so in this case, we can set a validation contract just to model those validations. Whereas the super users or the editors, we can write a validation contract that models the full breadth of attributes that they might want to change on the articles. Whereas if you had all your validations centralized on some sort of article model, then it becomes a lot harder to think about each of those validation contexts in isolation, let alone test them in isolation. So here you end up with two separate Ruby classes, two different Ruby objects with different responsibilities, and you can work with them much more easily and understand each one much more easily. And that's a really big part of the dry.rb philosophy, which is we value single responsibilities, and we try to create our gems so that people can build single responsibility components using them.
Okay. Yeah, you're speaking like the what's the Sandy Metz practical object-oriented programming?
Yes.
Which for anybody who's unaware, the Putter book, this is something I read early in my programming career. It actually changed. So it was like my first job as a junior engineer. It actually changed my approach about everything. And I still use these concepts even in things like JavaScript as well.
Yeah. When I read that book for the first time, I had that brain explode, I'm enlightened moment. But then I had immediately after this moment of confusion because Sandy preaches such amazing practices, but then I'd look back at the tools that I'm using at the time, and I just wouldn't know how to exercise those practices using those tools. Like I felt I'd be fighting my tools to exercise them. And all I wanted to be able to do was look Sandy Metz in the eye and feel good about the code that I'm writing. So in the end, what we did was create our own library of tools to let people more easily model their code in a way that adheres to some of these really helpful principles.
Okay. So yeah, we talked about the validations, and then we have these. So you have dry struct.
So these are sort of semi-related. They're in the sort of same family of tools. So this is all about precision modeling and clarity around your data. And Ruby is famously, it's fast and loose when it comes to handling types in general.
Yeah.
But it is helpful to lay on some strictness where it makes sense for your domain. So dry types is a data typing library. You'll see the example there. It gives you the opportunity to create well-named types that represent the structure for certain pieces of data that you want in your application. So, you might make, for instance, a type that represents an article slug, and you want to make sure that some piece of data is conformant with a slug. And for example's sake, we might say a slug has to be lowercase and dashes only. So you can create a type that represents that. And once you do that once, you can reuse that logic throughout the entirety of your application, including by making your own struct classes, which is the dry struct bit there.
Okay.
So you see there, class person. If we keep with my example, you might have class article.
Yeah.
These are the kinds of things that your Rails models typically represent. But the challenge of Rails models is that they do so many things. They model your data, they hold the attributes, they carry a live connection to the database, they represent validations, they do dirty tracking, they have a state that can be mutated in 1,000 ways, which makes it hard to test them, hard to understand how they're used. And it means that you have to be really careful when you pass them around your application, because some view over way on the other side of your app might make a query to the database by accident, and suddenly you've got an N+1 problem. With dry struct, you have the opportunity to model your domain entities as simple value objects. So this is an immutable object that carries just the data and allows you to add extra behavior around that data if you want. And you'll know they'll always be valid because they can't be initialized unless that data is already conformant to all those types and attributes. So you get a lot more confidence when you pass these structs around and work with them in your application.
Excellent. Yeah, you talk about I brought up the Putter book and Sandy Metz because as you're explaining this, I'm like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Like wrestling your tools is something that I definitely, as a junior engineer, when I first read that book, I felt like that I had the hammer, even though she actually specifically calls it out in the book not to do. But I had the hammer, and I was going to hammer everything I knew or everything I approached because I had like all this knowledge. But you find that really quickly, especially if you're in a Rails project, that you didn't have to build all these other abstractions that then I think might be counterproductive. Like I had there was another Clean Ruby book actually I read around shortly after that. I forgot the author of that, but his approach was like these service objects, and me and a few other people on our team started making all these service objects for everything, and it just turned out of hand. Like yes, we could test them really well, but no one could read the code because we got too clever. And I think that's another struggle that we have to sort of combat as we figure out how to do some of these things. Like the cleverness is where we really fall over.
Yeah, that's in fact one of the other things that dry.rb does help with in terms of building functional service objects, command objects, query objects, call them what you want. But dry system and some of its companion gems make it really easy for you to work with dependency injection inside your application. And dependency injection is one of the things in the Putter book that made sense immediately when Sandy introduced it, but I had no idea how to implement in real life. And so we provide a set of tools that organize all the components in your application and make it really easy for you to follow a simple pattern in terms of composing those components. So you'll see in that create article example at the bottom there, we include that module which defines the default dependencies that you want to be injected. And each one of those dependencies is an identifier in this container that organizes the components in your system. So it actually becomes really low friction to start to write single purpose composable components that can be tested independently, thought about in isolation, but then brought together to achieve far more powerful results.
Very cool. Yeah, so, I mean, monads, that's a sticky subject right there.
That's the last aspect of our sort of functional approach, but I use them a lot. They come with some baggage, but I actually find they're really helpful if you just think about them as a way to signal success or failure for your operations. And once you start to do that, you also get some really amazing benefits, like being able to chain them together safely and create sort of railway style programming in Ruby, of all places. So you get the benefits of some of these functional approaches, but you still get the comfort, flexibility, amazing ecosystem of this mature programming language that we use every day.
Awesome. So we just reached the end of our functional journey. I'm curious.
Yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
So the benefit of splitting these up is that you can pick and choose which of these you want to work with if you don't want to use them all together. And so we've got thousands of users, I'm sure, around the world. I know that dry.rb libraries, dry validation is used in Shopify. They have probably some of the most gnarly validations on the planet when it comes to shopping cart validation and things like that. Netflix uses dry struct and dry types. I know it's used in some systems behind the scenes at Apple. So it's beginning to become a widely accepted project. And in the early days, we saw a lot of people scratch their heads and wonder why we're building things in this way. That's because I think there are two types of people looking at dry.rb projects. There are the types that wonder why it's even necessary because they're writing simple applications that Rails serves beautifully. And then the other type is a person who instantly recognizes the need for these sorts of tools and knows exactly how they might want to slot them into their application. And by splitting them up like this, we've made it possible for that to happen.
Awesome. So I just jumped. As you were talking, I jumped into a whole nother into a repo. But I also want to acknowledge some of the people in the chat too that are joining. So I appreciate Mish helping guide everybody and saying hello. But just want to say hello to YG. Actually, I've seen you in my repos. I'm very happy you're here, and a couple other people too as well. Just been talking about the fact that we're not playing games on Twitch right now. We're showing off code, which is how games are made. I guess I'm not sure if there's any games that are using this library, but perhaps the websites that power those login dashboards. I'm sure. So I'm curious if we're able to get like a. Actually, I just noticed too as well, the use by is a great little way to find out at least what projects have installed dry validations in particular. So anybody who's interested in sort of jumping in there and figuring that out, definitely click that big old package button. But are you able to give us a tour of maybe one of the repos and sort of how the structure of it is laid out?
Yeah. So dry validation is probably a pretty good one to look at. In terms of how Ruby gems are packaged, these follow the standard practices. So we have a gem spec, which is the sort of the file that defines your gem. It's down the bottom there, dry validation.gem spec.
Oh, okay. There we are.
Yep. So that's just the sort of metadata that the Ruby gems package system uses in order to return information.
If anybody's
rubygems.org.
If anybody's not familiar with Ruby in Ruby gems, similar to like npm packages, pip packages, this is where Ruby sort of the community has collectively decided to put all their code for sort of installing and downloading. It lives here on Ruby gems. So I think if we
can you look it up, dry validation? Let's see. Nearly 10 million downloads. That's pretty good.
Yeah, not bad. That's a pretty good weekend. Oh, updated in the last. Oh, okay. I don't know if that was per month, but yeah, that's total.
That's all time.
Yeah.
This is not the JS ecosystem.
Yes,
but, we do our best.
Yeah. JavaScript, they're pretty intense with their downloads for sure. But yeah, awesome. And I see a familiar face.
Yeah. So that just goes to show when we say the package is managed by a small handful of people, only really 3 of those faces are still sort of actively looking after that project at the moment.
So I'm curious, before we jump back into the code, who supports this? So who's other than all your free time and sweat and tears, like how does a project like this stay afloat?
Through a lot of free labor. And, I want to acknowledge that I am privileged enough to offer that, which is something that is a tricky subject. But, there's a lot, people benefit a lot from open source in the broader community. And I'm very happy that I can contribute, but not everyone can. Open source contributions don't necessarily signify that you're more or less worthy as a developer. But I just so happen to have been lucky enough to put myself out there. But in terms of how these things are supported, it is an entirely volunteer-run project. In my previous job, I was one of the owners of the company, so I got to spend a bit of company time on it. But these days, it's all nights and weekends. And it's just something that we've all learned to become patient with. Open source happens when it happens. I think Ruby in particular doesn't have the huge corporate backing that you see in some language ecosystems or tooling ecosystems. So we just do our best. And fortunately, our community is really accommodating of that. These to our benefit, these are still relatively small projects, and it is manageable to stay on top of them as a side project. But yeah, that's how it happens. And I think all of us, the one nice thing about it is that we're not just making this exclusively on the side. We get to use all of these gems. So the three of the core team for dry.rb, which is me, Pyotr Solnitsa, who's the second face there, and Nikita Shilnikov, who's the last face there. We all use these tools in our work projects. So, and I think that's a really important aspect of the open source development lifecycle. You really need to be able to see the problems and feel the problems in your day-to-day application development life, identify needs, try and help satisfy those needs by building tools, and then use those tools again to see if they actually fit. That's a really important feedback cycle. And I'm really happy that I've been able to work through that feedback cycle over many years. And I think they've made for some really well-rounded tools today.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like, how does one person even approach, like, I've used a lot of libraries, I've used a lot of gems and a lot of JavaScript packages and et cetera, et cetera. Like, how does one person even think through or approach, or is it through company sponsorship or your own sponsorship when you're running a company? Like, how do you even approach to go into a project and say something's broken, or I would like to participate and ship something? And maybe we're jumping ahead of ourselves too, because like we literally just walked through looking at the metadata of a gem spec.
Well, that's a good question. And I would say that for projects like ours, which are mostly volunteer driven, those sorts of pieces of feedback and contributions are extremely welcome. If someone sees a need and discusses it with us and we all agree together that it's an adjustment or an improvement or a new feature that we think would fit with the ethos of these libraries, then that is really, really welcome. And I know Pyotr has certainly said on a number of occasions where he's gone through a whole month where with tools like dry validation, most of his job has been merging community contributions, which is an amazing thing when you see that open source network effect start to happen. But we're friendly people. We have a code of conduct on all our projects. These are spaces where people are welcome to come in and share their questions, their feedback, and hopefully that can lead to improvements to the tools.
Excellent. Yeah, we have some questions. I think I said ayahuasca, but it might be tenwaski. But yeah, Twitch handles are challenging, but we didn't really address the whole migration from version 1. But I think we could probably, if we have time, we can jump into the other project and maybe talk about that. But I did want to address that some people are asking if you're the maintainer of Ruby gems, and I don't know if you want to address that.
I'm not the maintainer of Ruby gems. The Ruby gem, I'm the maintainer of these Ruby gems, but not Ruby gems itself. Ruby has an amazing community of other people who handle things like that.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, hopefully we'll have the Ruby gems folks on in the future. We'll see how big this Open Source Friday becomes. So with the in my understanding of like Ruby gems is the I get the gem stack. Actually, I've built one gem, which is I'm only going to mention it because I love mentioning it, mainly because I built it on a weekend, like a Saturday, and it's called Marky Markdown, which is not an original name. I'm just going to say that out loud if anybody's wondering. But this was actually my first gem I actually published to Ruby Gems. I built a couple other gems, but mainly as training purposes. But it's a Markdown parser, so I can power my GitHub actions.
Nice.
And basically I take variables in Markdown. Actually, my action's called variables in Markdown. And then my example is like the way it works. Actually, I didn't do a good job in explaining the code and the README as I'm looking at it now. But I'm just taking a transformer, and then I'm transforming that transformer and then outputs the body with the variables been transformed. Sorry, that was it was a long way to get to a joke, and that's the second time I've done a stream where I got to this point where I share a marquee markdown, but I digress.
I think pun-driven development's a thing.
It is, and I feel like there's a lot of freedom in that.
Yeah, we sidestepped that with dry.rb by picking the world's most boring naming scheme, but it is naming is one of the hard things, so we sort of took care of that by coming up with a very simple rule.
Yeah, and we actually skipped over the fact of dry.rb actually being the acronym itself, and I picked up on the Sandy Metz philosophy of practical object-oriented design in Ruby, but dry is also an acronym, which is. Do you want to explain dry?
Yeah, it stands for don't repeat yourself. The idea being that if you have a thing that you need to do multiple times over, it makes sense to build some abstraction to help you do that thing without repeating the steps. So yeah, we sort of co-opted that for our organization name because each of these tools helps you avoid repeating yourself.
Excellent. Yeah, so I went down that tangent about Ruby gems because I understand like the code itself, like it should be pretty approachable. So did we want to look through some of the code and how that's sort of bundled and works?
So the lib directory is where all the implementation code lives, and that's the same for all Ruby projects typically. Ruby libraries, I mean, apps can be a bit different.
Yeah.
And the directory structure more or less mirrors your module namespace. So all of our modules, all of our gems live within the dry namespace. So we have that top level dry folder. And so everything dry validation related will be nested inside validation.
Okay. Ah, excellent. And we're looking at 60 lines of code, including
if only it were that simple. Yeah, that's the sort of the entry point file, which has the sort of main interface.
Gotcha. So I see
all of the rest.
Yeah.
So all of the rest is required more deeply in the project.
Okay, there we go. We're just gonna go one more turtle down.
So contract there would be that's the main class that you use when you work with dry validation. So you see that requires a whole lot of other behavior.
Yeah.
We use the standard Ruby tool for docs, inline API docs, which is called yardoc.
Okay.
So that lets you define introductory help, API example usages, as well as parameter specifications for classes and methods in Ruby.
So yardoc actually, do you run a command to then publish that somewhere, or is it published into another folder?
You can run a command. It's the yard command, and that will generate HTML. But in the Ruby world, there's a website that does it automatically from released gems and from GitHub, which is trying to find the name. No, I can't find it right now. But on our documentation website on dry.rb.org, we link to the API docs, which are generated from those comments.
Okay. Ooh, just lost my mouse. There we go. All right. And then the code itself, I mean, minus the comments, and sometimes you can get a little lost in the comments, I think, first time into a project. The comments are definitely necessary, especially since you're using yardocs. But do you want to explain the sort of how this contract works?
Yeah, I mean, so we're already seeing other dry.rb libraries in usage right here.
Yeah.
We use dry equalizer. That is another dry.rb library which provides equality behavior to objects. So dry equalizer here says that a contract is comparable to another contract if its schema rules messages match. That's that top line there. So that's just a very simple mix-in that gives us equality behavior. It's a really powerful tool to use. We also use dry initializer, and that's what gives us these options below. So each of those options are options you can pass to the initializer of the contract class when you create an instance of it. So these are really kind of nitty-gritty details about the contract.
Yeah. Okay.
Typically though, call here is the main, that's a good one to point out. Call here is the main interface. So you define a contract, You specify your validation schema and any other validation rules. And then you initialize your class. So you've got a contract instance at that point. And then to use it, you call it with some input data. And we use call quite meaningfully here because each of these objects, and this pattern is followed across many of the dry.rb projects, each of these objects can be considered a functional object or even like a function on its own. So the idea is that this is a pure function. You call it with some input data, it'll give you the same output every single time. And that object can be called multiple times over with different inputs and you get different outputs. And there's no mutable state, which means that you can much more readily pass validation contracts around your app and reuse them in different places.
Okay. And
it also means you can mix these. Call, for those who are new to Ruby, is the interface that Ruby uses for its closures, which are like blocks, lambdas, procs, whatever. There are various ones, but this makes our objects interchangeable with those, which means that sort of data processing pipelines become possible, and you can mix and match.
Okay, yeah, you get the same sort of features that you would get from a proc. Okay, and then sorry, sorry, this was an interview question they had years ago. What's the difference between a proc and a lambda?
A lambda will. I'm on the spot here. I did talk about this years ago. You can do a lambda has stricter arity checking. Okay. So arity is like the number of parameters that it takes. And with a proc or a block, you don't have to pass exactly the number of parameters that are defined in those, but a lambda you do. And a lambda you can also do an early return from, whereas you can't necessarily do that in all situations with a proc or a block.
Okay.
Let me know if I can work at GitHub now.
Oh, well, the question, the interview, I had that question, I ended up getting that job, but I definitely fumbled through that pretty heavily because I'd use both of them, but I just being able to articulate that, I just did not know.
I mean, that's one of the things that makes Ruby great is that there are more than one way to do anything.
Yes,
and it gives you the space to work within to express your logic in the most concise or most correct or the nicest way possible. And that's to its credit and to its fault. But I think it's why so many people love the language.
Excellent. And then I think the thing about Ruby is a lot of the stuff is pretty readable, like error, and it might be self-explanatory. But my assumption, if I were to take a guess, because this is in a private, I saw a private flag. Oh yeah, private here, that this is this is going to take over if there is an error in the project. How would you explain this?
So that's private API within the class. That's one of the things that Yardok is good for. But what you can look for is when you call a contract, if you just scroll up to that call method, you will get returned a result. Yes. So all the behavior you get on the output of calling that contract is all on the result object. Yeah. And result does have an errors message. So you can check if it was a successful result or a failure result, and then inspect the error messages, and you get the information about whether your validation succeeded, and if it didn't, why it didn't succeed.
Okay. Excellent. This looking at this code makes me want to write more Ruby code, and also makes me want to actually try out the project as well. So I'm enticed. So then the other question about there's more than one way to do everything. I'm curious. Testing. I see a spec file. Am I going to see many tests when I open this?
No, you'll see rspec.
rspec.
That's just something that we all instinctively chose to use because it's a tool that we're already familiar with and already happy with. rspec is probably one of my favorite Ruby tools because it's so powerful and expressive. And I love nothing more than refining my test suite, making things fast, making my tests expressive, because in the typical testing cycle where you want to run them frequently while you change your code, the more effort that you put into making those tests nice, the better that cycle becomes. So we use rspec to test all of our libraries. And in fact, the test suite is a great way if you have questions about how things work and the documentation maybe hasn't quite explained it. Being a volunteer-run project, the docs are sometimes the last things we do. and there's always more we could do there. But the test suite is also a great way. If you know Ruby, you can dig in, you can see how each feature of the tools is meant to work, and learn a little bit more about the different ways they can be used.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm a big fan of looking at tests. It's actually the first thing I did. Actually, the first thing I did when I joined GitHub. I mentioned I don't actually contribute to GitHub's GitHub.com, but I did start reading the tests once I got my laptop and had my my GitHub locally. I just started just scrolling through because it was a wealth of information. Because I long time Rubyist, so it's just like a lot of fun to look through there. There was a question about Rubicop. If y'all using Rubicop in the project.
Yeah, we actually have a fairly sophisticated setup. If you hop back to the dry.rb organization, one of the things you'll see there is that we actually have more than 20 different repositories that we look after. And so one of the challenges was actually making it manageable to work on all of these and to keep them consistent over time. And Piotr actually put in a huge effort to do this. So he created a DevTools repository, and that's where we keep a lot of common elements, like a Rubicop rules definition. We keep, let's have a look. I think we keep a gem spec there that we generate based on templates. And these are all hooked up together using Ruby, using GitHub Actions. Oh, yeah. So whenever there's a change to this DevTools repository, some actions run that actually push out the DevTools changes to every single dry.rb project. And that's been a huge help in terms of making it easy for us to manage all these things.
That's excellent. I mean, I'm a GitHub Actions fan. Of anybody who follows me on Twitter is very well aware. And Actions, I did not think Actions would come up in this conversation, but it has. And
so we use Actions for this. And you see there, gem install Aussie. That's the name of the tool that we use to create these sort of template files that we spread across all the projects. We use Actions for CI, and just how fast they are is amazing. We also use Actions to build our website. The website was previously just a single repository made with Middleman, which is a Ruby static site generator. Yep. But we had this challenge here where the docs would drift away from the actual implemented features because they're in different repositories.
Yeah.
So now we have a doc site directory in every repository. So Dry Validation has one. And that actually has the markdown files for our user documentation. And then every time there's a change in those directories, we use a GitHub action to incorporate them into the documentation website and spin up a new build and push that up to GitHub pages. So it's a really nice cycle, and it lets us update docs and code in the same place, which is something that means we can take care of the both at the same time.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And Aussie, is that supposed to be open source, or is that supposed to be play on Aussie?
No, it's not. I think it's just your open source buddy, maybe something like that. Yeah.
Okay, clever. You need a mascot.
Yeah, that would be nice.
The Octocat's taken now, so you'll have to.
Yeah, open source tools are pretty sophisticated these days. We don't have a mascot, but at least we have a logo and a relatively presentable website.
So I did want to make time for questions. If anybody else had questions, and address the question that around the version 1 migration to. It's
for Hanami, I presume.
Yes.
Yeah, that's something we'll still have to consider. It's challenging because we're changing. Hanami version 1 tried to make things as stateless make its objects as stateless as possible. Make it so each object is a single responsibility object within your application. And it got a lot of the way, but not quite all the way. And part of what we're doing with version 2 is to really embed that philosophically deep into the soul of the framework and to have everything follow that philosophy as much as possible. And at the same time, we're re-implementing many parts of Hanami on the dry.rb libraries, whereas before it wasn't the case. So this means there are going to be changes. I'm not sure how the migration path will look for version 1 to version 2. The nature of the applications isn't changing. We still have views as standalone objects, actions as standalone objects. You still have a routes file. Hanami model will become more powerful, but we're still building these things, and we're yet to get to the point where we think about the migration path. But what I hope is that it'll be an enticing new release, and people will want to bring their applications up to that version because it makes things so much more powerful and makes it possible to model your application with even more clarity than you could before.
Excellent. So I appreciate you taking the time to answer that question too, and hopefully, Ayawaski, Tenwaski, I forget. I apologize. I didn't see if you actually corrected me on your name, but perhaps you can help and jump into the issues and help triage, which brings me to, well, one, I'm gonna YG actually. I was just gonna mention I did triage your issues in mutual fund, so just gonna call you out there and answer your question. I'll show everything I've triaged yesterday on my stream, which is bdougeo, which I think was linked earlier. But I'm curious if where's the first place, you had mentioned testing, but where's the first place that someone would go to if they're like, okay, I like dry.rb, I like what you're putting out, so where can I help today?
Well, I think the first place is to go to the website to peruse the list of gems, learn about how they work, and start to use them. These are used by thousands of people, but relative to the size of the Ruby community, the Ruby ecosystem in general, that's still a very, very small number of people.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of use cases that maybe haven't been touched upon because everyone has a different application, everyone has a different context, everyone wants to do things in different ways. So the first step would be just to try them out and to learn how they can satisfy your needs. If there are any gaps where they're not satisfying your requirements, and then come back to us and chat about them. We have a discourse forum where we talk about the gems and we do support. And we have a chat room in Zulip, which is a great way for a bit of a faster back and forth.
What is Zulip?
Yeah, Zulip is the chat system there on the right.
Oh, okay. I've never heard of
that. It's like Slack, but it's topic based. So threads are like a first class feature, and they support open source organizations by giving free accounts. So we found it's a really useful tool for us.
Okay.
So that would be the first step, would be just to try them out. And then if you're using them and you want to understand how things work, drop into the code, start to explore, and then come to us in the forum with questions. And ultimately, if we decide that something can be implemented, then that's your opportunity to do something. The good thing about the gems, I think, is that because they're focused, it is easy to get a sense for what they do. Yeah. It's not an insurmountable task to read through the code of one of these gems and understand what it does. And because they're focused and because they have a clear boundary, like they're not trying to do everything, which means hopefully contributions are more possible than, gems that are 3-4 times as old or 3-4 times as big. So that would be my recommended first steps. Other things you could do, we have issues on GitHub and we tag them as help wanted whenever we can. Oh yeah, there we go, help wanted. So there's only 29 of them. A lot of these gems are actually getting close or have just recently passed their 1.0 release, which is a big milestone, which means we're happy with the initial functionality. They can always be made better, but those opportunities come when people come with new use cases and want to talk to us and, if possible, bring some of their own ideas and time to the project.
Cool. Sorry, I was answering a question around our non 1080p stream. We're streaming in high output of 720, and it's really around legibility. I think I spent a lot of time in the last stream zooming and doing a lot of stuff, and this stream I've not zoomed hardly ever. So yeah, this is addressing that question. And I appreciate this tour. Also want to point out, if anybody wasn't aware, I know you have Yeah, there's only 3 issues here, so probably not the best project to check it out on. But if you
Yeah, dry validation has a fair number of issues, if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, let's go to that one. But if you go to /contribute,
all right,
tribute, you can actually see there's one. And the way I think maybe it goes by help wanted in docs. Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, but actually it also perhaps the conversation. So it's just machine learning that does that. So perhaps the conversation made it seem like someone was already taking care of it. So yeah, that's what this little feature does. It just sees anything that's actually ups or grabs, not just simply labeled. I'm also curious. Did you catch the satellite announcements last week?
The event took place while I was asleep, but I did read the summary of all the announcements. Yeah.
Yeah, I would highly recommend GitHub discussions giving that a spin too as well.
We're keen to give it a try. I mean, it's the more we can put in this collaboration hub, the easier everyone's life gets, I think.
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to starting to use it for my projects. I've had access to it for a bit, but it's hard to really test a feature when only you have access. Oh, and it looks like perhaps I spelled it wrong. But it should be there somewhere. Team management. Maybe it's not on here. I know it is... Yeah, it probably didn't make the front page yet.
It's still progressively being rolled out, so maybe it's not there yet.
For sure, yeah. We only have a handful of projects using it today, but highly recommend checking that out. But yeah, also, actually, I did want to wrap up and wind down to see github.com/stars. So if you don't mind, and if I spelled that right, not stars, but stars, do you mind going to that on your screen?
Yep.
I'm curious if anybody in the chat too, if you want to go to github.com/stars, check it out and let me know what the last repo you starred was. So I'll go first. I'll go first and explain that we're doing a meetup actually tomorrow. Well, it's my tomorrow, but it's technically only a few hours. No, it's going to be 8 hours from now. Yeah. So we're doing a meetup with India. So it's going to be the India meetup. And highly recommend we're going to do it here on twitch.tv/GitHub. So if you are around or you happen not to be in this time zone, feel free to check it out. So I started that repo because I'm announcing it right now. And then the other thing is Crazy Max was actually on the stream. He was in the chat earlier today. And he has a GitHub action for GitHub pages. So I just started because he's super helpful and he answers a lot of questions and shows up on my streams. And I didn't know he actually had actions. Actually, I never even looked at his GitHub account until today. So it was cool to see Crazy Max has got some code out there. And 87 stars, that's pretty good too. So what do you have, Tim?
I just dropped it in the Zoom chat so you can bring it up.
Now I have to figure out where. Oh, this is the chat.
Or do you want me to say it?
I got it.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is the last project I have started. And there's a few things to say about this. It's written by Test Double, which is an excellent agency and a long time sort of supporter and contributor to the Ruby ecosystem. And Justin Searles was one of its founders, and he's the one building this. So a couple of things to say here. I think you come to Ruby for the language, but you stay for the community.
Yeah.
And Justin is one of the stalwarts of the Ruby community. He is an amazing speaker, and he shares his ideas openly. And what he's doing here is particularly interesting to me because it's blending these two modes of building websites. I love writing with Ruby, so I'll keep doing it for as much as I can. But not everything needs a full-blown app. So Justin's experimenting out in the open here with this approach of writing a Rails app, but also having that app host a statically generated website for content that doesn't need to be dynamic.
Yeah.
And this is a fairly trendy approach these days for good reason. You'll see your last interviewee, Tim, works for Vercel, right? So this is one of their things where you can have your dynamic and static JS applications like hosted in the same system. Justin's, I think, trying to angle at this from the Ruby side, which I think is really interesting because despite Ruby perhaps having gone past that peak of the hype cycle, there's still a lot you can do with it. And there's no reason that we should give up all that we've learned necessarily just to try a different application deployment or configuration methodology. So this is a cutting edge thing. And I'm just following along with his experiments.
Yeah, and it's funny that I was completely unaware of this. So actually, I've been watching Justin since beginning of my career. So I went to my first conference he spoke at, and then I've just been hooked on his presence on stage, but also all the libraries that he puts out, as well as Test Double. They do a lot of great work. But this term Jamstack, it's funny enough. I actually host a podcast which is called Jamstack Radio.
Oh, wow.
And I'm very familiar with the term because I've been doing Jamstack type projects for quite some time. So I didn't think I was going to be pitching this podcast, but
there you go. Yeah.
If you're interested.
My thing with Ruby is it's a language that endures for a good reason. Yes. And there is always the opportunity. So the dry.rb project came well past the early mid 2000s when Ruby was at the peak of its popularity, but there is always the opportunity for someone to try something new and interesting in this language. And in fact, the language makes it possible to try new and interesting things easily because it's so flexible. And this is just another piece of evidence that you can still use Ruby for so much today.
Yeah. Yeah, it is awesome. I did actually reach him out. So this is my podcast, and I'm definitely going to reach out to Justin to see if he wants to chat about static Rails and the story behind the project. And also, I just gave it a star. I encourage everybody in the chat to also give it a star. I want to shout out that someone starred the Hanami 2 application template, which was your project. I assume it's your project. It's under your name.
Yeah, that one's under my name. That's the sort of unofficial how to get started with Hanami in the meantime until we build the fully fledged application generators and everything.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so I gave that a star, so then you have 16. Everybody else follow suit, share stars. I mean, they're free, so like don't hold out. And yeah, Tim, thanks very much for jumping on and chatting with me. I had a lot of fun learning about this project. I don't know if you have a hard stop, but if anybody has any other questions, feel free to drop
I've got a few more minutes, so yeah, happy to answer questions.
Yeah. Other than that, I think we answered all the questions. So anybody will stick around for a bit. Nice. Cool. Well, if there's no questions, yeah, I think this was super insightful, and I'm always looking for reasons to write Ruby code, and that's why some of my actions are powered by Ruby, and I was super pleased to see that you had that you're using actions to keep all your project in sync. So I'm gonna actually dig deeper into that, and actually should even start that repo too as well. I'm a big fan of starring, so I store stars everywhere. But I'm not sure if you were familiar with github.com/stars out there.
How many stars do I have? Let's have a look. I have 793 stars.
Excellent. Mish says in the chat that she stars everything. Yeah, they're free. Why not? So.
And 405 of them are Ruby projects.
Excellent. Yeah, that's also cool. Like, I think mine are actually mostly JavaScript projects because that's what I spent the last 3 years writing, is tons of React code at my previous employer. But yeah, I'm at 52 Ruby, 254 JavaScript. So there's a bit of an imbalance in in 47 Go. So actually I start as much Ruby as I do Go. So that was another life though, the Go code. Excellent. Well, I'm gonna end the stream. I think let me just give a last check with the chat. Everybody's just dropping emojis and stars, and yeah, big fan. So if you want to sit in chat still stays on, but the stream will stop now. So everybody have a good weekend and go ship some code. on a
Just
Friday.
yeah, if it hasn't become clear during this stream, I love talking about this stuff. I'm more than happy to answer questions on Twitter. My name is Tim Riley on Twitter, TimRiley. So yeah, if you think of something later on, anyone who sees this, yeah, feel free to hit me up.
Awesome. Yeah, sorry, I didn't even tell people Tim Riley. It's actually below your head too as well. So I know you haven't seen the stream, but it is below in the cards.
Cool.
So definitely check that out, people. And I'm BWO, and this is Open Source Friday on the GitHub Twitch.